The Uses of Enchantment, The Meaning and Importance of Fairy Tales by Bruno Bettelheim. From Part 2, In Fairyland, Goldilocks and the Three Bears. This story lacks some of the most important features of true fairy tales. At its end, there is neither recovery nor consolation. There is no resolution of conflict, and thus no happy ending. But it is a very meaningful tale because it deals symbolically with some of the most important growing up problems of the child, the struggle with the Oedipal predicaments, the search for identity, and sibling rivalry. In its present form, the story is of recent origin, although it is derived from an ancient tale. Its short modern history illustrates the development over time of a cautionary tale as it acquires fairy story characteristics, becoming ever more popular and meaningful. History demonstrates that a fairy tale's appearance in print does not preclude its being revised in later editions. But when such altering occurs, the changes, in contrast to the time when fairy tales were only perpetuated orally, reflect more than just the personal idiosyncrasies of the storyteller. Unless he is an original artist, an author recasting a fairy tale for a new printing is rarely guided mainly by his unconscious feeling for the story, nor does he have a particular child in mind when he wishes to entertain and enlighten or help with a pressing problem. Such changes are instead most often instituted on the basis of what the author thinks a general reader wishes to be told. Designed to satisfy the desires or moral scruples of an unknown reader, the tale is often recounted in ways which are trite and commonplace. When a story exists only in oral tradition, it is largely the teller's unconscious that determines what story he relates and what of it he remembers. In doing so, he is motivated not only by his conscious and unconscious feelings for the story, but also by the nature of his emotional involvement with the child to whom he tells it. In many such oral repetitions of a story over many years by various persons to different listeners, a version is finally reached which is so convincing to the conscious and unconscious of many people that no further change seems appropriate. With this, the story has attained its classic form. There is general agreement that the original source of Goldilocks is an ancient Scottish tale of three bears which are intruded upon by a she-fox. The bears devour the trespasser, a cautionary tale warning us to respect others' property and privacy. In a small homemade book written by Eleanor Moore in 1831 as a birthday gift for a little boy and discovered again only in 1951, she told the story with an angry old woman as the intruder. It is possible that in doing so, she mistook the vixen of the original to mean not a female fox, but a shrewish woman. Whether this alteration was a case of mistaken identity, a Freudian slip, or deliberate, it was the change which began the transition of an old cautionary tale into a fairy story. In 1894, another probably quite old rendering of the story became known from the oral tradition, in which the intruder helps herself to milk, sits in the chairs, and rests in the beds of the bears, which, in this version, live in a castle in the woods. In both these stories, the intruder is most severely punished by the bears, which try to throw her into a fire, drown her, or drop her from a church steeple. We do not know whether Robert Southey, who published the story for the first time in printed form in 1837 in his book The Doctor, was familiar with any of these older tales. But he made an important change, since the first time the intruder jumped out to the window and her further fate remained unknown. His story ends, "Out the little woman jumped, and whether she broke her neck in the fall, or ran into the wood and was lost there, or found her way out of the wood and was taken up by a constable, for a vagrant as she was, I cannot tell." But the three bears never saw anything more of her. There was immediate positive response to this published version of the story. The next alteration was made by Joseph Kundell, as he explains in a dedicatory note of 1849 to the Treasury of Pleasure Books for Young Children, which appeared in 1856. He made the intruder into a little girl and called her Silverhair. Silverhair, or Silver Locks, became in 1889 Goldenhair, and finally, in 1904, Goldilocks. The tale attained great popularity only after two more important changes. In Mother Goose's Fairy Tales of 1878, Great Huge Bear, Middle Bear, and Little Small Wee Bear became Father Bear, Mother Bear, and Baby Bear, and the heroine simply disappears out of the window. No longer is any bad ending for her anticipated or told about. With this spelled out designation of the bears as forming a family, the story unconsciously came to relate much more closely to the Oedipal situation. While it is acceptable that a tragedy should project destructive results of edible conflicts, a fairy tale cannot. The story could become popular only because the outcome was left to our imagination. The reason such uncertainty is acceptable is that the intruder is seen to interfere with the integration of the basic family constellation and thus is threatening the family's emotional security. From a stranger who invades privacy and takes property, she changed into one who endeavors the family's emotional well-being and security. It is this psychological underpinning which explains the sudden great popularity of the story. The relative shortcomings of a rather recently invented fairy tale as compared with an ancient, many times retold folk tale appear when one views Goldilocks in relation to Snow White, from which some details were lifted and modified to improve the original Three Bears. In both tales, a young girl lost in the woods finds an inviting little house that is temporarily deserted by its inhabitants. In Goldilocks, we are not told how or why the girl got lost in the forest, why she needed to seek refuge, or where her home is. We do not know the overt or the more important underlying reasons for her being lost. Thus, from its inception, Goldilocks raises questions which remain unanswered. While the greatest merit of a fairy story is that it gives answers, fantastic though these may overtly be, even to questions of which we are unaware because they perturb us only in our unconscious. Despite the historical vicissitudes, which changed the intruder from a vixen to a nasty old woman to a young, attractive girl, she is and remains an outsider who never becomes an insider. Maybe the reason that this tale became so immensely popular at the turn of the century was that more and more persons came to feel like outsiders. We are made to feel for the bears whose privacy have been invaded, and we feel for poor, beautiful, and charming Goldilocks who comes from nowhere and has no place to go to. There are no villains in the story, although Baby Bear is robbed of his food and has his chair broken. Unlike the dwarfs, the bears are not taken with Goldilocks' beauty. Nor are they moved by a tale of woe as the dwarfs are on hearing Snow White's story. But then Goldilocks has no story to tell. Her entering is as enigmatic as her leaving. Snow White starts with a mother who deeply desires a daughter. But the idealized mother of infancy disappears and is replaced by a jealous stepmother who not only ejects Snow White from her home, but threatens her very life. Sheer need to survive forces Snow White to risk the dangers of the wild forest, where she learns to make a go of life on her own. The edible jealousy between mother and daughter is sketched clearly enough for a child to comprehend intuitively the emotional conflicts and inner pressures underlying the plot. The contrast in Goldilocks is between the well-integrated family represented by the bears and the outsider in search of himself. The happy but naive bears have no identity problems. Each knows exactly where he stands in relation to the other family members, a fact made more obvious by naming them father, mother, and baby bear. While each has his individuality, they function as a threesome. Goldilocks tries to find out who she is, what role is appropriate to her. Snow White is the older child struggling with a particular phase of her unresolved edible conflicts, the ambivalent relation to the mother. Goldilocks is the pre-adolescent who attempts to cope with all aspects of the Oedipal situation. This is symbolized in the significant role the number 3 plays in the story. The 3 bears form a happy family where things proceed in such unison that no sexual or Oedipal problems exist for them. Each is happy in his place. Each has his own distinct dish, chair, bed. Goldilocks, on her part, is utterly confused as to which of the 3 will fit her. But in her behavior, the number 3 appears long before Goldilocks encounters the 3 dishes, beds, chairs, for 3 separate efforts mark her entrance into the bear's dwelling. In the Southie rendering, the old woman first looked in at the window, and then she peeped in at the keyhole, and seeing nobody in the house, she lifted the latch. Some later versions have Goldilocks do the same. In others, she knocks 3 times at the door before entering. Peeping through window and keyhole before lifting the latch suggests an anxious and avid curiosity about what goes on behind the closed door. What child is not curious about what adults do behind their closed door and would not wish to find out? What child would not delight in the temporary absence of the parents, which permits a chance to pry into their secrets? With Goldilocks having replaced the old woman as the main figure of the story, it becomes much easier to associate with her behavior a child's peeping to discover the mysteries of adult life. 3 is a mystical and often a holy number, and was so long before the Christian doctrine of the Holy Trinity. It is the threesome of the snake, Eve, and Adam, which, according to the Bible, makes for carnal knowledge. In the unconscious, the number 3 stands for sex because each sex has 3 visible sex characteristics: penis and the 2 testes in the male, vagina and the 2 breasts in the female. The number 3 stands in the unconscious for sex also in quite a different way, as it symbolizes the Oedipal situation with its deep involvement of 3 persons with one another, relations which, as the story of Snow White among many others show, are more than tinged with sexuality. The relation to the mother is the most important in every person's life. More than any other, it conditions our early personality development, affecting to a large degree what our outlook on life and ourselves will be, whether optimistic or pessimistic, for example. But as far as the infant is concerned, no choice is involved. The mother and her attitude to him are a great given. So, of course, are the father and one's siblings. And so are the economic and social conditions of the family, but these influence the young child only through the impact on his parents and their behavior toward him. The child begins to feel himself as a person, as a significant and meaningful partner in a human relation when he begins to relate to the father. One becomes a person only as one defines oneself against another person. Since the mother is the first and for a time the only person in one's life, some very rudimentary self-definition begins with defining oneself in regard to her. But because of his deep dependency on the mother, the child cannot move out into self-definition unless he can learn on some third person. It is a necessary step toward independence to learn I can also rely on some person other than mother, before one can believe that one can manage without leaning on somebody. After the child has established a close relationship to one other person, he can begin to feel that if he now prefers mother to this other person, it is his decision, no longer something about which he feels he has no freedom. The number 3 is central in Goldilocks. It refers to sex, but not in terms of the sexual act. On the contrary, it relates to something that must precede mature sexuality by far, namely, finding out who one is biologically. 3 also stands for the relations within the nuclear family and efforts to ascertain where one fits in there. Thus, 3 symbolizes a search for who one is biologically, sexually, and who one is in relation to the most important persons in one's life. Broadly put, 3 symbolizes the search for one's personal and one's social identity. From his visible sex characteristics and through his relation to his parents and siblings, the child must learn with whom he ought to identify as he grows up and who is suitable to become his life's companion and with it also his sexual partner. The search for identity is clearly alluded to in Goldilocks with 3 dishes, chairs, and beds. The most direct image for a need to search is that something which has been lost must be found. If the search is for ourselves, then the most convincing symbol for this is that we have gotten lost. In fairy tales, being lost in the forest symbolizes not a need to be found, but rather that one must find or discover oneself. Goldilocks' embarkment on her voyage of self-discovery begins with her trying to peek into the bear's house. This evokes associations to the child's desire to find out the sexual secrets of adults in general and of the parents in particular. This curiosity often has much more to do with the child's need to gain knowledge about what is involved in his own sexuality than with a wish to know exactly what his parents are doing with each other in bed. Once inside the house, Goldilocks explores 3 different sets of objects: dishes of porridge, chairs, and beds in regards to their suitability. She tries them always in the same sequence: first father's, then mother's, and finally the child's. One might view this as suggesting that Goldilocks investigates both which sex role fits her best and which of the family positions, that of father, mother, or child. Goldilocks' search for herself and role in the family begins with eating, as every person's first conscious experience is being fed, and his relating to another person begins around being fed by mother. But Goldilocks' choice of Father Bear's dish suggests that she wishes to be like him, male, or that she desires most to relate to him, as does choosing first his chair and bed, although her experience with the porridge and the chair should have taught her that what belongs to him is not fitting for her. It is hard to come closer to a girl's Oedipal wishes than by suggesting that Goldilocks tries to share bed and board with a father figure. But as the story tells us, whether it is a wish to be a male or to sleep in father's bed, this does not work. The reasons are that father's porridge is too hot and his chair is too hard. So, disappointed that a male identity or intimacy with father is not available to her or is too threatening, one might get burned, and too hard to manage, Goldilocks, like every girl experiencing deep edible disappointment in the father, turns back to the original relation to the mother. But this does not work out either. What had once been a warm relationship is now found too cold for comfort. The porridge is too cold. And while mother's chair is not too hard to sit in, it is found to be too soft. Maybe it envelops as mother envelops the infant, and Goldilocks rightly does not wish to return to that. As for the beds, Goldilocks finds Father Bear's bed too high at the head and Mother Bear's too high at the foot, showing that both their roles and intimacy with them are out of reach for Goldilocks. Only Baby Bear's things fit her just right. So nothing seems left to her but the role of the child. But not quite, as Goldilocks sits in Baby Bear's chair, which we are told was neither too hard nor too soft, but just right. The bottom of the chair came out, and down came hers, plump upon the ground. So, obviously, she has outgrown the small child's chair. The bottom indeed dropped out of her life because she could not find success in being or relating to, first, father, and second, mother, but it did so only when after these failures Goldilocks reluctantly tried to return to an infantile, baby-like existence. For Goldilocks, there is no happy ending. From her failure to find what is fitting for her, she awakes as if from a bad dream and runs away. Goldilocks' story illustrates the meaning of the difficult choice the child must master. Is he to be like father, like mother, or like child? To decide who he wants to be in respect to these basic human positions is indeed a tremendous psychological battle, an ordeal every human being has to undergo. But while the child is not yet ready to be in father's or mother's place, just accepting that of child is no solution. This is why the 3 tests are not sufficient. For growth, realization that one is still a child must be coupled with another recognition, that one has to become oneself, something different from either parent or from being merely their child. In folk fairy tales, as distinct from an invented one such as Goldilocks, things do not end after 3 efforts. At the end of Goldilocks, no resolution of the identity problem is projected, no self-discovery, no becoming a new and independent person. Still, Goldilocks' experience in the bear's house at least teaches her that regression to infantilism offers no escape from the difficulties of growing up. Becoming oneself, the story suggests, is a process begun by sorting out what is involved in one's relations to one's parents. The bears and Goldilocks do not provide help. On the contrary, they are appalled and critical that a little girl should try to fit herself into Papa's bed and to try to take Mama's place. The opposite happens in Snow White. The dwarfs, far from finding fault with Snow White for tasting from their 7 plates and glasses and trying 7 beds, admire the little heroine. While the bears awaken Goldilocks with their dismay, the dwarfs make sure that Snow White's sleep remains undisturbed, even if they have to inconvenience themselves. Much as the dwarfs are taken with Snow White's beauty, they tell her right from the start that if she wants to remain with them, she has to accept obligations. If she wants to become a person, she has to act maturely. The dwarfs warn her of the dangers which growing up may entail, but even when Snow White goes against their advice, they repeatedly help her out of her troubles. Goldilocks receives no help with her growing up problems from the bears, so all she can do is to run away, scared by her own daring, defeated in her efforts to find herself. Running away from a difficult developmental task hardly encourages a child to pursue the hard labor of solving one at a time the problems which growing up presents to him. Further, Goldilocks' story does not end with any promise of future happiness awaiting those who have mastered their Oedipal situation as a child, and again as an adult when these old difficulties recur, now to be solved in more mature ways. Goldilocks is sadly lacking in this respect, since only great hopes for the future provide a child with the courage which enables him to go on struggling until he achieves selfhood. Despite the shortcomings of Goldilocks when compared to other folk fairy tales, it has gained considerable merit. Otherwise, it would not have gained such popularity. The story deals with the difficulties in achieving sexual identity and the problems created by Oedipal desires and efforts to gain first one and then the other parent's undivided love. Because Goldilocks is an ambiguous story, much depends on how it is told. The parent who, for his own reason, delights in the idea that children should be scared off from peeping into adult secrets will tell it with a different emphasis than a parent who has empathy with the child's desire to do so. One person will be in sympathy with Goldilocks' difficulties in making her peace with being a girl, another will not. Some people will feel more deeply for Goldilocks' frustration when she must accept that she is still a child, but also that she must grow out of childhood, though she may wish not to do so. The story's ambiguity permits telling it with emphasis on sibling rivalry, its other main motif. Here much depends on how, for example, the incident with the broken chair is told. It can be told with empathy for Goldilocks' shock when the chair which seemed so fitting suddenly breaks down, or in the opposite way, with glee either about Goldilocks' pratfall or the fact that she broke Baby Bear's chair. When the story is told from the perspective of Baby Bear, Goldilocks is the intruder who suddenly comes from nowhere, as did the next younger sibling, and usurps or tries to usurp a place in the family which, to Baby Bear, was complete without her. This nasty intruder takes away his food, ruins his chair, even tries to drive him out of his bed, and, by extension, to take away his place in his parents' love. Then it was understandable that it was not the parents' but Baby Bear's voice that was so sharp and so shrill that it awakened her at once. Up she started and ran to the window. It is Baby Bear, the child, who wants to get rid of the newcomer, wants her to go back where she came from, never to see anything more of her. Thus, the story gives imaginative body to the fears and wishes a child has about an imagined or real new arrival in the family. If seen from the point of view of Goldilocks, Baby Bear is the sibling, then we can empathize with her wish to take away his food, destroy his toy, the chair, and occupy his bed so that he will no longer have any place in the family. Interpreted thus, the story becomes again a cautionary tale, now warning against giving in to sibling rivalry to the degree that one acts destructively against the sibling's possessions. If one does this, one might find oneself left out in the cold with nowhere to go. The great popularity of Goldilocks with children and adults alike derives partly from its manifold meaning on many different levels. The young child may respond mainly to the motif of sibling rivalry, delighted that Goldilocks must go back from whence she came, as so many children wish the new baby would do. An older child will be enthralled by Goldilocks' experimentation with adult roles. Children will enjoy her peeping and entering. Some adults may like to remind their children that Goldilocks is expelled for it. The story is particularly timely because it depicts the outsider Goldilocks in such an appealing form. This makes it as attractive to some as it is to others because the insiders, the bears, win. Thus, whether one feels like an outsider or an insider, the story can be equally enchanting. The change in title over time shows how a story protecting the property and psychological rights of insiders, the bears, became one which concentrates attention on the outsider. What was once called the Three Bears is now known mainly as Goldilocks. Further, the story's ambiguity, which is so much in line with the temper of the times, may also account for its popularity, while the clear-cut solutions of the traditional fairy tale seem to point to a happier age when things were believed to permit definite solutions. Even more important in this respect is the story's greatest appeal, which at the same time is its greatest weakness. Not only in modern times, but through all ages, running away from a problem, which in the unconscious means denying or repressing it, seems the easiest way out when confronted with what seems to be too difficult or unsolvable a predicament. This is the solution which we are given in Goldilocks. The bears seem unmoved by her appearance in and sudden disappearance from their lives. They act as if nothing had happened but an interlude without consequences. All is solved by her jumping out of the window. As far as Goldilocks is concerned, her running away suggests that no solution of Oedipal predicaments or of sibling rivalry is necessary. Contrary to what happens in traditional fairy tales, the impression is that Goldilocks' experience in the bear's house made as little change in her life as it did in that of the bear family. We hear nothing more about it. Despite her serious exploration of where she fits in, by implication of who she is, we are not told that it led to any higher selfhood for Goldilocks. Parents would like their daughters to remain eternally their little girls, and the child would like to believe that it is possible to evade the struggle of growing up. That is why the spontaneous reaction to Goldilocks is, "What a lovely story." But it is also why the story does not help the child gain emotional maturity.